Today, we're going to take a little break from talking about the supernatural creeps out there and focus our lens on some true stories of some of the worst of the absolute worst who've managed to escape the long arm of the law. Number 5. Robert Fisher. Robert Fisher was a man living in Arizona with his wife and 2 children, living quietly. He had worked as a surgical technician and had previously attempted to become a Navy SEAL. He was an avid outdoorsman, an expert hunter, angler, and camper, and found himself frustrated that his children didn't quite share this love of the outdoors with him. Fisher did all he could to present himself as an all-American, white picket fence, nuclear family man, but the truth was far more complicated than that. A child of divorce, Fisher had intense issues regarding separation. He and his wife fought constantly over everything, and reports from friends say that he was cruel, controlling, and manipulative to her during their marriage, refusing to let her decorate the house how she wanted, berating her constantly, and so forth. As well, he didn't socialize much outside of his family and was described as a loner. In late 2001, his wife Mary Fisher had had enough, and after nearly 20 years of marriage, was planning on filing for a divorce. On April 9th, 2001, neighbors would overhear a loud argument from the Fisher property. Later that night, the property would explode, burst into flames. Firefighters found inside the property the bodies of Mary Fisher alongside the Fisher son and daughter. Mary had been shot and the other victims slashed. Robert Fisher himself was not recovered at the site. Robert was thought to have set off the explosion in his own home intentionally as a way of burying his evidence and his tracks, and is thought to have fled entirely, hoping to begin again under a new identity. The thought process from police being he was terrified of Mary leaving him and afraid of repeating the childhood trauma of his mother's divorce. He saw fit to end the lives of his family rather than put them through that experience. Now, friends of Fisher had noted that there had actually been a pattern of worrying behavior before this. Allegedly, on one hunting trip after successfully bagging an elk, Fisher took the blood from the exit wound and smeared it all over his face. Another occasion describes him sneaking up on a family at a picnic to scare them by firing off shotgun rounds into the air, or an altercation in which he fatally a neighborhood dog for attacking his dog, although the police had suspected there was foul play. Fisher was never found, and police aren't even sure if he's still alive. One detective working the case said, "Maybe this is all we'll ever get. Maybe this is the best we've got, knowing he did it and never finding him again." And my ghouls and goblins, if it's scary stuff you're looking for, Top 5 Scary's gotta be one of the top 5 best places to watch scary videos. Ghosts, cryptids, real crimes, aliens, we got it all. Take a look through the cursed archives and see where it takes you. Now let's keep going. Number 4. Richard Lynn Baer. Richard Lynn Baer is an interesting exception on this list, as he's the only one of these fugitives who actually was caught. Now, the problem with this is that he was not caught for very long. Didn't really take, as he escaped from jail shortly after being apprehended. Richard was wanted for the death of Sherry Hart, a divorcee and young mother who was waiting for a date on January 15th, 1984. Her date had stood her up, and she changed her evening plans to go out and have fun with high school friends Jeffrey Burgess and one Richard Lynn Baer. However, the evening would take an extremely dark turn when Baer would make an advance at Sherry Hart. She rebuked him, and infuriated and incensed, Richard bashed her with the butt of a handgun and ordered that Burgess drive them about an hour and a half away into the woods. Lynn Baer then dumped Sherry out of the vehicle in the woods, leaving her bleeding heavily. Burgess had told police he'd acted under the threat of his life, as Baer had told him he would see to it that Burgess died if he said anything about what had happened that night. However, Burgess was more than willing to cooperate with the police, leading them to finding Hart's remains and arresting both Baer and Burgess for the crime. However, Burgess would escape days before being tried from the small-town county jail, where he fled, adding him to the FBI's most wanted list for his crimes and unlawful flight to avoid persecution. As of this recording, the trail had gone completely cold, and Lynn Baer was never found again and is still wanted. Burgess passed away at the age of 46, having spent most of his life in and out of prison on various unrelated charges. Number 3. Bradford Bishop. Until I can prove that he's dead, I'm going to assume he's still alive. That's the words of Montgomery County Sheriff Raymond Knight, speaking on our next entry, Bradford Bishop. This notorious criminal has been on the FBI's most wanted list for years, and has managed to elude capture this entire time. In fact, he was taken off of the FBI's most wanted list in late 2018 to accommodate more serious fugitives, had FBI had some reason to believe he might not even still be alive. Bradford Bishop was an unusual case, as he was a fairly promising career man with no stains on his record. He was working as a counterintelligence official, a former army serviceman, and he worked as a diplomat. Life seemed to be going fairly well for Mr. Bishop, who fathered 3 children with his wife Annette, where they lived in Bethesda, Maryland. On March 1st, 1976, Bradford was passed over for a promotion at work that he was due for. He left the office a little bit early, telling his secretary he wasn't feeling well that day. He would then drive to his bank, he withdrew a large amount of money, and he went to fill up gas in his car and then to a hardware store to purchase a shovel, pitchfork, and a sledgehammer. Bradford would then return home and ended the lives of his family members one by one. He would carry their bodies into the trunk of his car, where he drove them deep into the swamp nearly 300 miles away, where he buried and lit the bodies ablaze in a shallow grave, burning the remains of his once happy family. There would be a few sightings of Bradford afterwards. He was last seen buying tennis shoes with an unknown woman and a dog March 2nd. On March 18th, his car was discovered by police at an isolated campground all the way over in Tennessee. The contents of the car were unnerving. A blood-soaked blanket, a shotgun, an axe, and the well for the spare tire was soaked in blood. A jury indicted Bradford, and that was the last time any evidence of the case ever emerged. Now, since then, there have been numerous unproven sightings, sporadically appearing throughout Europe mostly, but nothing that has contributed to an arrest. If Bradford Bishop is still alive, he is 86 and has still evaded capture. Number 2. The Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom was the self-given nickname of a serial criminal around Washington, D.C. who has never been identified. He first made himself known in the early 1970s, seemingly taking a page out of the Zodiac's coded puzzling handbook. The Freeway Phantom taunted the police with cryptic messages and puzzles teasing his capture. 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard was found dead in November 1971 with a note inside one of her coat pockets. The note read out as follows: "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Signed, the Freeway Phantom." The name happened to catch on. There are few criminals who offer to write their own monikers, but clearly the Freeway Phantom had a brand in mind. Over the course of a 17-month period, 6 similarly aged young black women were found all along the highway, all missing their shoes and all showing visible signs of trauma. Police had been working on what they thought had been promising leads, including an investigation into 2 former police officers who were being convicted of a separate crime. However, none of these investigations ever turned up anything concrete, leading the FBI to take charge of the case in 1974. However, it was around this time that the trail started to go cold, and no more deaths following the Freeway Phantom's MO appeared, luckily. Although tragically for the victims' families, no justice would ever be found either. The investigation is still active in some aspects in Washington, D.C., although, given that it's been 5 decades since the first victim was found, it's hard to think that any serious progress might be made on this case. Perhaps the identity of the Freeway Phantom will never come to light, but at the very least, it seems as if the brutal series of crimes had stopped. Number 1. The vending machine. When you were younger, did you ever hear about the urban legend of someone putting poison in candy, or someone putting a razor blade inside of a chocolate or an apple or something and giving it out to trick-or-treaters? Probably have. I mean, I've even talked about it before in a previous video on urban legends. It's the kind of story that you'd hear on a playground, and it would scare you and stick with you for life. You tell yourself that kind of thing only happens in the movies, and no one in their right mind would ever go around poisoning unsuspecting people. But that's perhaps because you've never heard of this case. The case of the mysterious vending machine criminal in Japan. This wave started in April of 1985. People around Western Japan, primarily in Tokyo, were dying under mysterious circumstances. The first victim died shortly after purchasing 2 bottles of a popular Japanese soda, Orinamen C. In the next coming weeks, there were 35 cases of mysterious poisonings, all tracked back to Orinamen C purchased at vending machines. At the time of the crime spree, the company producing Orinamen C had been running a promotion where their vending machines would give out a second bottle of the product after purchasing one, and the criminal took advantage of this fact, lacing bottles of the soft drink with a powerful poison, and he placed them inside or on top of the vending machines to deceive consumers into believing that they'd been a winner of the promotion and they got that extra second bottle. Shortly after, police issued citywide warnings across all vending machines to inspect each drink carefully to see if the seal on the bottle cap had been tampered. Of these 35 cases, 12 of them were fatal, making the Orinamen C tampering the deadliest product tampering case in history. Police had absolutely zero leads, and the nature of the crime made it incredibly difficult to track down, as the bottles had been dispersed seemingly randomly across western Japan. As well, there did not appear to be any greater motive, no intentional victims. There was nothing to link them together, as the victims that had all been afflicted had been completely random. Police had suggested, though, that they think the suspect was a single agent acting alone, who had meticulously planned the crime. A psychologist suggested possibly that the crime was carried out as a response to Japan's orderly and aggressive work culture, and that this was a lashing out by hurting unsuspecting people that the victim would never have to face. They would get a sense of rush and control, but never have to directly deal with the consequences. Whoever was behind the Orinamen Sea tampering spree was never caught. There were cases across Tokyo afterwards police suspected might have been copycats, but no leads and no arrests were ever made.
Number 5. Randy Greenawalt and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison, where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The 2 men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert, where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers and Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades on death row. Number 4. Lida Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lida Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lida married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lida was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lida a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meir, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lida. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lida was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the Old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bedsheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief. Number 3. Nikolai Jumagaliev, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet Army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year, whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later, and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he had invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him, but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least 1 more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities before decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had based on witness statements to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their number 1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess, he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini, and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times, before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country, pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian, looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them. Not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to begin calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force, who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old, after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.
Number 5. The Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe I just said those words. The Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe that's the real name newspapers went with to call this guy. I know not everyone's gonna be able to get a nickname like Jack the Ripper, but you can't go around calling criminals stuff like the Servant Girl Annihilator. You're just gonna inflate their ego. You're making him sound like he's a Dark Souls boss, or he's gonna be jumping in the ring against Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik. Anyway, sorry, I had to get this out of the way before we could talk about it. I feel like we just had to address this name. We couldn't just look at that and move on. And you know the wildest part? He doesn't even have the craziest name on this list. Okay, let's get into it. The Servant Girl Annihilator was the nickname of a brutal night stalker who preyed on the streets of Austin, Texas in 1885, a full 3 years before Jack the Ripper would stalk Whitechapel and steal all the fame and fortune in the attacking women at night community. Despite his name, he actually didn't exclusively target women. Unlike his British counterpart, Mr. the Ripper, the SVGA attacked men and women, although he mostly focused his attention on women, and they were all servant girls, which is where the name came from. He ended up slaying 7 women and 1 man, and critically injured 6 women and 2 men on top of that. All of his victims carried out the same way, attacking them whilst they slept in their beds, and then dragging them out into the streets when he was finished with them, usually with a sharp object such as a knife or a needle sticking out of the ear. There was a wild manhunt for the Annihilator, and it's said that in 1885 some 400 men were questioned and interrogated about the identity of the Annihilator. Elected officials apparently refused to believe that it could be the work of one lone psycho, thinking there was a group of men committing these crimes together for Lord knows why. While several men would end up being questioned, no one was ever successfully linked to these brutal crimes. He was never caught, but an increased presence by sheriff's department and citizens forming an armed militia to protect the streets were enough to scare off whoever was doing it into fleeing the area, and eventually the crime stopped. So where did he go? That's the question, because he was never found. There are some who even wonder if perhaps maybe he bought himself a train ticket and found his way to Whitechapel to continue his spree. And my friends, if you're looking for more true crime stories, more rumors, whispers, conspiracies, cryptids, aliens, video games, movies, and whatever else we got, Top 5 Scary has it all. Number 4, Bible John. Everyone on this list has a weird nickname. Everybody. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I'm just gonna spoil that for you. Coming up next on this list is going to be Bible John, who's got a name that is deceptively unassuming. Bible John was an infamous executioner who preyed on women in Glasgow in the late 60s. All of his victims he met at a popular nightclub, the Barrel and Ballroom. He operated for a few years and is confirmed to be connected to at least 3 cases and maybe more. He was subject to one of Scotland's most extensive manhunts. He was the first time a composite sketch in the country was ever used as the front page of the newspaper. All because there were so few details about the case or just who he was. What few tidbits of trivia and information we have on Bible John, his crimes, his motives, and his modus operandus come from one of the victim's sisters, who very briefly shared a taxi with Bible John and her sister on the night of her death. Her very brief witness, it was only a 20-minute trip, was all the information they had to provide investigators to form a psychological profile of him, aiding in the investigation. Now, the name Bible John would stem from his practice of obsessively quoting the Bible and ranting and raving about adultery to his victims before, well, you know. The statement we have with Gene Puttock states that in the short period of time they spent together, he was making nigh constant and frequent references to specific Bible passages and really hammering home how much he hated adulterous women. He preyed on brunette women who all looked fairly similar and found them all at the same nightclub, charming them and then attacking them. Their bodies would later be found naked in the streets with signs of strangulation. The only witness, one Gene Puttock, passed away in 2010, with no more leads and the case having been on ice for nearly 50 years. It's very unlikely Bible John will ever be found anytime soon if he's still out there. Number 3, the Doodler. Next up on this list is the Doodler. Like everybody else, don't let the goofy name fool you into thinking there is anything silly or funny about this guy. Now, this bizarre nickname would come about from his habit of drawing pictures of his victims before he would attack them. And I guess the drawer or the sketcher or the artist didn't quite roll off the tongue the same way that the Doodler did, and that's the name they went with. The exact body count of the Doodler is unknown, but police believe that it could be anywhere from 6 to 14 victims total in San Francisco, stretching from 1974 to 1975. Several men disappeared from the city's gay community and more were injured. And part of what made him so hard to identify is that despite the city's historically very liberal and accepting view of the LGBTQ+ community, at the time the larger mainstream whole community hadn't quite got there yet. And so several of the men who would end up surviving an attack were too worried about outing themselves to want to cooperate with the police, leading to very few victims cooperating with the police, meaning there was very little information for any of them to work with, and the criminal was able to successfully elude pursuit. Ironically, for someone named the Doodler, the composite face sketch they had from witnesses is the only real bit of evidence they ever had to work with. However, unlike a lot of the other cases on this list, this one is actually still actively ongoing. There's a $200,000 reward for anyone that has any additional information. And as of 2019, this case is still ongoing, with DNA and fingerprint evidence being used to try to narrow down the ever wide net of potential subjects of interest and hopefully get some closure on a horrible chapter in San Francisco's history. Number 2, the Pickler. Now, I've talked about the Pickler before on this channel, but his story is so horrifying and honestly unbelievable that it's worth repeating at least once. Again, goes without saying, like every single entry else on this list, the Pickler leads you to believe this is going to be a silly story, but wait about a minute, I'll explain why he's called the Pickler and all the pieces will come together and you'll regret clicking on this video. This one's kind of a dark one. The Pickler's real name was Bela Kiss, and he worked as a tinsmith in the early 1900s, living in a humble small village in Hungary. He had been married and he had children, but his wife had left and with her took the children. He moved in a housekeeper who served as his sole faithful companion. His housekeeper would note that he seemed to entertain a plethora of female guests and was never hurting for women's attention, although she didn't talk to any of the guests much. Outside of his women callers, Kiss was actually fairly isolated. He kept to himself mostly, he didn't interact with his neighbors much at all, or the community as a whole, instead preferring to tend to himself and living quietly alone with his housekeeper and his big collection of metal drums. He had a stockpile of metal drums all over his property, and when people would ask about them, he said that he was stockpiling gas. In 1914, Kiss would be conscripted to serve with the Hungarian army and left behind his home to his noble housekeeper. While deployed, Hungarian soldiers were running low on resources, and when they needed gas, some soldiers on patrol saw fit to take from Kiss's collection all over his property. However, when they went to recover the gas, they were shocked to discover what the barrels actually contained. No gas to be found, but instead the bodies of several missing women floating in alcohol in an attempt to preserve or pickle their corpses. See what I mean? Not pleasant even remotely. There were 20 barrels in total, and inside each one was another missing woman. But perhaps most alarmingly of all of this is that they appeared to have been drained of their bodily bodily fluids with punctures in the neck, which sounds made up. As if this guy wasn't scary enough, there's also the very real possibility that he might have been a vampire. Now, upon this discovery, the Hungarian army immediately moved to try and locate and apprehend Baleokostas, but discovered that that would prove quite difficult, since he had both a very common Hungarian name at the time, and he was also deployed in the middle of the largest conflict the world had ever seen at the time, and was just one more face in a green uniform. Somehow, Kiss learned that he was being pursued and faked his death by leaving behind a corpse in a hospital that had his ID. Kiss fled and was never seen in Europe again. A few scattered sightings would report him throughout New York, but he was never found and eluded capture for the remainder of his days. It's unlikely he's still out there, but you never know. And finally, number 1, the Zodiac. If we're talking about evil people who've managed to elude capture, it might feel a little obvious to put the Zodiac as number 1, you know? But he's also one of the most infamous, strangest, and scariest criminal stories in American history, so it's never a bad story. Well, it is. It's a terrible story, but it's a very interesting one to hear. The Zodiac terrorized California throughout the late 60s and early 70s, personally claiming responsibility for 37 victims. He stole headlines and media attention for years, as the state was fascinated and terrified by what he would do next, and if he would ever be caught. His exploits have been the subject of a few films and TV, most famously David Fincher's Zodiac, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr., dramatizing the investigation trying to find him unsuccessfully. Although he himself insisted that he left a trail of 37 bodies, the police were only ever able to connect 5 different deaths to the Zodiac. People would be attacked by a lone gunman, with nothing seemingly connecting the cases. Motive, modus, everything was unclear. The case would become legendary when he sent his infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, containing details that only the real assailant could have possibly known about the crimes, inviting and challenging police to a game to catch him. He sent out a postcard boldly displaying "My name is," and then a blank spot, with an invitation to solve one of his puzzles. If you saw the new 2022 Batman movie, Paul Dano's Riddler is directly inspired off the Zodiac, all of his methodology, taunting people, leaving weird riddles at his crime scenes, that sort of stuff. His letters were threatening, taunting, and incomprehensible. The code he wrote in would stump detectives for years, to this day, with only one of his ciphers ever being solved, and it not being nearly enough to connect any dots. The riddle that was solved spelled out a confession of sorts, but it mostly served as the Zodiac gloating about the nature of his crimes and saying that he did it solely because he thought it was fun and that it was the most thrilling, fun thing a man could do, described as being better than hunting games or getting your rocks off. He didn't mention whether or not it was better than writing riddles and codes though. Now at the time, obviously they looked into just about everyone they could, and there were several prominent suspects and people of interest, but nothing concrete and final. The rest of his riddles were never solved, and as far as we know, he was never caught. However, in 2018, a private team of investigators was absolutely determined to close the case once and for all, and put an end to one of California's most infamous mysteries. They had identified an 80-year-old Gary Francis Post, who had passed away. He resembled the composite sketches of the Zodiac, and forensic evidence had actually made some compelling arguments that could tie it to being him, but the FBI have denied this claim, and say that they still consider the case open. Will it ever be closed within our lifetime? We may never know, but the one thing that's certain is that we are not going to stop trying until we get some answers. You want my theory? Personally, I think Jack the Ripper is the Zodiac. I think that would be the ultimate plot twist to the end of all of this. Number 5. Frank Matthews. Our first spot is notorious criminal kingpin Frank Matthews, a legendary crime lord operating out of New York in the 1960s, who also had some pretty cool classic mafia names like Pee-wee and Black Caesar. Built himself a criminal empire that Los Polos Hermanos would have been jealous of. Starting out small, working in racketeering and illegal gambling ops in Philly in the 1960s, he had his sights set on much bigger things, working his way up, collecting numbers, making contacts, until he could start selling product for some serious money. By the early 1970s, he was already trading millions of dollars for illegal narcotics, importing his stuff from Latin America and distributing it throughout the states. Pee-wee had his hands and pockets across the country, with his criminal web spanning across 21 states at its peak. Naturally, if you're moving that much stuff around the country with that many people involved in your operation, eventually somebody's gonna get wise, and that's exactly what happened. Boys in Blue tapped Frankie's phone communications and put out a federal bulletin for his arrest. By December 1972, Frank and his girlfriend were arrested at McCarran International in Vegas. Okay, so he got caught. This kind of breaks the list a little bit, but hear me out a little bit here. Because after spending a paltry couple months in jail. Frankie made bail and quickly got out of Dodge to literally never be seen again. Now, there is some discrepancy as to what happened. The FBI suspects that he was taken care of by a major New York crime family for fears he may turn witness. But they did also post a bounty, a $200,000 bounty for finding him, so they suspected he might still be out there. No trace of him was ever found, no body ever discovered, and his story went cold. Is he sleeping with the fishes, or did he return to pull strings from the shadows? Or maybe he pulled a Saul Goodman and started managing a Cinnabon in Omaha, living life on the lam. Man, that's 2 Breaking Bad references in one point. I gotta spread them out a little bit more. We got lots more than awkwardly wedging in Breaking Bad references on Top 5 Scary. We've got the best horror content on the web at least twice a day, every day, so hit subscribe and stay spooked. Number 4, the Pickler. You know, at first glance, this is not a particularly threatening nickname. It kind of sounds like the absolute lamest Z-tier excuse for a Batman villain that you'd throw in as a warm-up before, you know, fighting the actual cool villain of that issue. Well, names can often be so deceiving because there really is not a lot that's funny about the Pickler once you understand why they called him that. He's maybe one of the most bizarre and macabre criminals I've ever read about. The Hungarian Bela Kiss lived in a small village near Budapest in the early 20th century. He lived with an elderly maid, but otherwise kept to himself. Didn't have a tight circle of friends, but he did enjoy frequent female company. I mean, of course, with a name like Bela Kiss, makes sense. I gotta stop trying to make this guy sound cute because I'm gonna regret it in like 1 second. In 1914, during the height of the First World War, Bela left to fight with his country. Now, wartime sometimes necessitates borrowing resources wherever you can, and the Hungarian army was short on gas. On Bela's isolated property were dozens upon dozens of oil barrels all conspicuously laid out in his yard. Someone alerted the soldiers and they went to go borrow a cup or two, and were shocked to discover that upon cracking open the barrels were the bodies of several women floating in alcohol in a depraved attempt to preserve the corpses. Hence where the foul nickname the Pickler came from. See, it's not nearly as funny once you know why they call him that. 20 barrels, 20 missing women. That's somehow not even the scariest, craziest part of this whole story. The women had punctures in their necks and were drained of blood, which sounds completely made up that this guy might also have been a vampire. Now, the Hungarian army moved to seize Bela immediately, but tracking him proved rather difficult, as he had a fairly common name and was also, you know, he was in a war. Somehow, Bela was alerted that police had discovered his operation, and he left a corpse posing as himself in a military hospital and fled, never to be found again. Reported sightings popped up for a few years here and there. Allegedly, he moved to New York to begin a new life, but Bela eluded capture for the rest of his life. Unless he really was a vampire and is still out there, but I don't even want to entertain that possibility. Number 3, D.B. Cooper. Now, our next entry, I would hesitate to call him as evil as the rest of some of these crooks, you know? Sure, he hijacked a plane, sure, he held the entire plane hostage, and sure, he stole $200,000 from the government, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. D.B. Cooper's case is one of contemporary crime legends, as all that I just described sounds like he would be FBI public enemy number 1, right? Like they'd be working round the clock to bust this guy? They'd have him within the week? He slipped through authorities' fingers, and to date, D.B. Cooper was never caught. We don't know if that was even his real name or just an epithet he was using for the plane. We don't know anything really too concrete about him. Depending on what your definition of success is, D.B. Cooper could possibly be considered one of the most successful criminals of all time. To get into the nitty-gritty of the details, on November 24th, 1971, a man, using the possible alias Dan Cooper, boarded a flight to Seattle, and almost as soon as it took off, he passed a note to a flight attendant indicating that he had a with him, and that he demanded that when the plane landed, he trade the passengers on the flight for $200,000 and 2 parachutes. That's a smart man. He didn't want to waste any of that money on parachutes. The note said that if anything funny happened, he would blow the plane up. They complied out of fear, and upon landing, he was given the money by local authorities. Cooper then seized the plane one more time, holding the flight crew hostage with plans to fly to Mexico City. But midway through the flight, Cooper pulled a little point break and jumped out of the plane with all the money with him. And that would be the last time anyone would have ever seen D.B. Cooper. The FBI chased him for years to no avail. Nothing was ever found. No body ever recovered. No suspect ever caught out of a laundry list of people of interest. Some of the bills were recovered, but that's the only piece of evidence. Now, my absolute favorite theory about D.B. Cooper, and it's kinda out there, is that he's legendary cinema director Tommy Wiseau, and that this is where his fortune came from, as the man is shrouded in mystery regarding where his seemingly limitless supply of money comes from and his mysterious origins. Is it completely ridiculous and has no basis in reality? Yes, but it's also hilarious. Now, as for any more likely suspects for Cooper, there were a couple of Special Forces veterans who lined up with physical descriptions who could have been capable of committing the heist, but no concrete charges were ever made, and to date, no trace was ever found. Number 2. The Zodiac. Possibly one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Zodiac was a notorious criminal, famed in equal measures for his slayings and for his chilling obsession and interaction with the police trying to track him. He was made a household name after a Hollywood flick starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. depicting the efforts trying to find him. The Zodiac is known to be responsible for 5 different deaths terrorizing California in the late 60s and early 70s, although he himself claims responsibility for 37 victims. The Zodiac case became legend when he sent his now infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, providing details only he could have known about the crimes, and challenging the police to a sick game of sorts, sending them incomprehensible ciphers and riddles that supposedly contained clues to his identity and the crimes within. Only one of his ciphers was ever solved, and the rest remain a mystery. The Riddler from the new Batman movie is a direct inspiration from the Zodiac's sinister dealings. For 5 years, the Zodiac would taunt his pursuers with riddles and codes, sending horrifying cards, taunts, a letter boldly displaying "My name is blank," and then a cipher below it teasing their inability to find him. A postcard with his symbol written in blood, amongst others. Part of what makes the Zodiac such a fascinating and truly horrifying case is how much he seems like a movie bad guy come to life. The planning makes him out to be some sort of sinister criminal mastermind, and it's hard to disagree with that proclamation when he's completely eluded any form of capture for the better part of 50 years. There were several possible suspects as to who the Zodiac could have been, but nothing conclusive. To date, people are still trying to find the answer, hoping something new might come up to put that nightmare to rest. Number 1. Jack the Ripper. If you want to talk about evil that's got some staying power, it's hard to top Whitechapel's most infamous resident ever, 134 years avoiding capture, which means he could still be out there. The 18th century Night Stalker has held an almost supernatural-like grip over public interest since we first ever heard about the case surrounding the brutal 5 slayings we know about, who knows how many more. Preying on women and using the cover of the night, Jack eluded, stupefied, and taunted the streets of London, leaving a disgusting trail of blood and gore in his wake, leaving victims looking like the aftermath of a butcher's. He seemed to take a sickening glee in his violent delights, mocking his would-be pursuers, sending the police threatening letters and even organs from his crimes. Jack is an almost modern mythical boogeyman, appearing across hundreds upon hundreds of works of fiction, TV shows, movies, video games, you name it. Assassin's Creed even tried to say he was part of the Order. That's a little out there. There are some folk who offer that Jack the Ripper is the progenitor to all true crime fascination, which honestly kind of makes sense. As much as he terrified Londoners at the time, the media was obsessed with him, with the original media buzz surrounding him, paralleling how we talk about most brutal crimes these days. You can bet your bottom pounds that if Jack was terrorizing London today, there'd be podcasters talking about him in between sponsored ads for MeUndies. Jack's crimes shocked Londoners, as the vicious and public nature of the slayings were not exactly commonplace. So surely, in 130 years, someone had to have some idea as to who Mr. the Ripper was, right? Well, with a case as famous as this, obviously there are some options. A quick glance at Jack's Wikipedia page suggests a possible 31 different suspects over the years who've all been attributed to it, and those are just the ones who made the page. It's worth noting that we are still looking, we are still trying to find him, put this case to rest, because everyone wants to be the one to say they unmasked the Ripper.
In 5th place, we have the world record holder for longest prisoner on the run. In November of 1955, 22-year-old John Patrick Hannon was sentenced to 21 months in Verne Prison, which is located on the Isle of Portland, for stealing a car and assaulting 2 police officers. He broke out from the facility with fellow inmate Gwyneth Thomas after only 30 days by using a knotted bedsheet to climb over the wall. Guess it's not just a myth. After escaping, the duo burgled a nearby gas station and stole overcoats, beer, and cigarettes. You know, priorities. I guess the jackets would help with like crafting a disguise, but I think I would have tried to take, I don't know, some food so I could stay undetected longer. But hey, that's just me. The beer and cigarettes, I guess I can chalk up to dudes being dudes in the 50s, and maybe this particular store didn't have a large supply of anything else. While John is still on the run, Gwyneth, also 22 years old, was found only 16 hours after this daring escape, having been spotted by a truck driver. Now, a hunt for John was held, with the police pulling out all the tools in their arsenal, from police dogs to roadblocks, but he could not be found. A police description at the time said John was 5'7" tall, with brown hair, blue eyes, and a proportionate build. Now he's about 68 years old, and he's believed to be living somewhere in Ireland. In 1998, Dorset police appealed directly to John to give himself up, writing in a police force newsletter, "If you read this, Mr. Hannon, please write in. We'd love to hear from you." And while that sounds fun and all, If caught, John would face a charge of escaping from lawful custody and have to finish the remainder of his sentence. It would then be up to the Home Secretary to decide whether he should be pardoned. So if you're out there listening, whatever you're up to, it's obviously working, and I'd love some tips on how to stay off the grid more myself. In fourth place, we have the only New York State prison escapee who's never been found. Victor Fuara was supposed to be headed to the mess hall at 10 a.m. on February 6th of 1997, which, funny enough, happens to be the year I was born. Instead of his planned destination, he simply walked away from Mariah Shock Incarceration Facility in Minville. I couldn't really find an exact sounding, so you folks let me know if I got this right or wrong. In the days that followed, upstate newspapers ran stories about the disappearance, and correction officers, troopers, and police dogs scoured the area around the minimum security men's prison. The searchers followed footprints that led from the facility to the only entrance of a shuttered iron mine across Fisher Hill Road, and that's where the trail ended. State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision spokesman Thomas Maley said in an email that it ultimately was determined, based on the evidence, that Victor had most likely fallen into one of the abandoned mine shafts and the risk to the well-being of the search crews was too great to continue. Here's where the spooky part comes in, because, well, we can't have a list without it. Victor's body was still never recovered, so it's believed that he's very much currently on the run. His escape led the agency to review its security procedures ahead of court appearances by inmates. He had snuck out of the prison shortly after being issued street clothes for an upcoming meeting with a judge. Nowadays, inmates at the shock facility who are given civilian clothes remain under watch by a prison guard until they're transferred to court custody, which, makes sense. For folks like myself who are unaware of what a shock facility is, since I've mentioned it, a couple of times, it's a 6-month boot camp where young offenders are put through a military-style routine of exercise, work, education, treatment, and life skills counseling. Successful completion of the program can significantly shorten an inmate's sentence. Victor was serving a 1 to 4 year sentence for felony attempted possession and escaped from the facility just 3 months into his sentence. The 21-year-old had been arrested the previous summer by Albany County Sheriff's investigators on an Adirondack Trailways bus leaving Albany for Utica. Investigators had boarded the bus at around 3:40 in the morning on August 1st of 1996 in search of people carrying, and Victor was busted with 60 packets of heroin. We don't know much about his personal life, with the 5'5" tall man having no tattoos, a 7th grade education, and no employment at the time of his arrest. In third place, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. Before his time in prison, 23-year-old Glenn was living with his 22-year-old girlfriend, waitress Connie Weeks, in Sarasota, Florida. The relationship seems to have not been ideal. In January of 1975, a policeman intervened to prevent Glenn from physically attacking Connie on the street during an argument when he already had her hair in his fist. The policeman, who was off duty at the time, arrested Glenn on the spot and called for backup to bring him to jail. But Connie bailed him out later that day. That same night, Glenn showed up at the Sarasota Memorial Hospital, carrying Connie in his arms, claiming she'd slept in the shower. It was a stupid lie, and the doctors and nurses who tended to Connie phoned the police. And rightfully so. She passed away in the hospital later that week, and a judge sentenced Glenn to the electric chair. The young man attempted to escape prison almost immediately, attacking a guard with 2 accomplices and managing to climb out a window. This first attempt didn't get very far, with all 3 men being caught, and a Florida judge added 5 years to Glenn's life term. By 1990, Glenn seemed to be turning over a new leaf, with his behavior over those 15 years being described as exemplary, and prison authorities gave him permission to work in a furniture construction shop, designed to give inmates vocational training and a sense of purpose. But to the shock and surprise of no one, Glenn had a secret plan. On February 21st of 1990, he slipped into one of the boxes of furniture that was set to be shipped off the premises to a warehouse. No one noticed the extra weight as they loaded the crate into a truck, nor did they notice, during the entire drive to Daytona Beach, anything shifting around in the back of the truck. No footsteps, no clunking lids, no sound of the back panel sliding open or dropping shut. But upon arrival, one open crate contained a discarded prisoner's uniform, and the Polk Correctional Institute was missing a man. No one has yet to hear from him again, and he's been allegedly spotted in Florida and Alabama, where his family happens to live, but never officially found. In second place, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. Glenn was born on June 26th of 1958 in Miami, Florida, but grew up in Palm Springs after his family moved to California in the 1960s. He attended Palm Springs High School, where he was remembered as a star student, playing trumpet in the school brass band, graduating in 1975. In 1980, while working as a self-employed tool salesman, a mechanic, and a construction worker, Glenn and his roommate, Frank Soto Jr., planned to rob a and pilot, Kim Robert LaValle, who was once a friend of theirs. Great company. Glenn and Frank lured Kim back to their place, where they took his life, and those details are too much for me to describe. After the death, the duo loaded the body into a truck and set off for the desert, with Glenn originally trying to blow up the evidence by using homemade explosives strapped to the body. The explosion was apparently intended to disguise the cause of death? Okay, I might be delirious with exhaustion right now, but that doesn't exactly sound like a brilliant plan to me. Eventually, residents of the Eagle Mountain area found the blown-up pickup Glenn and Frank had ditched, along with what was left of Kim. Police were able to identify the body and charged Glenn with first-degree death, with a sentence of 26 years to life in prison in 1983. Yeah, totally shocked there. In 1987, Glenn attempted to escape during his incarceration at Dual Vocational Institute in California, and he was moved to Folsom State Prison, a maximum security prison. Authorities believe his wife, Shelley Rose Godwin, and his former cellmate in Dual, Lorenz Karlik, helped to plan his next escape, which was successful, and the reason I'm chatting about him here today. On June 5th of 1987, he cut a hole through wire fence using a hacksaw and other tools that had been smuggled in for him, and escaped into a storm drain that emptied into the American River. It's believed that Glenn dropped through a manhole and crawled 750 feet through the pitch-black drain until he reached a raft that an accomplice had left for him, and was guided away by following painted arrows on rocks that directed him where to go. In June of 1987, Lorenz was arrested in Hesperia, California, and convicted for aiding Glenn's escape. He had previously been arrested after a foot chase with deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. He was convicted in January 2002 of 8 charges related to that pursuit, and in January of 1988, Shelley Godwin was classified as a federal fugitive for her role in her husband's escape, and was captured by the FBI in Dallas, Texas on February 7th of 1990. Now, unlike some of the other folks on this list, we actually have an idea of where Glenn might be. Originally fleeing to Mexico, he unsuccessfully participated in the illegal trade before being arrested in Puerto Vallarta and convicted for trafficking in Guadalajara, Mexico, sentenced to 7 years and 6 months to Puente Grande prison in 1991. While American authorities were working on Glenn's extradition proceedings, he allegedly ended the life of a member of a Mexican cartel in prison. The new death allegation delayed his extradition, which gave Glenn more time to execute another escape, which occurred in September of 1991. Geez, was he a student of Houdini or something? Glenn is currently believed to be somewhere in Latin America, having possibly used aliases such as Dennis Harold McWilliams, Nigel Lopez, and Miguel Carrera. He is considered to be armed and extremely dangerous and an, obvious flight risk. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $20,000 for information leading to his capture, if anyone out there feels like, trying to hunt him down. And finally, in first place, we have Vasilis Paleokostas. He grew up in a small village in the mountains in central Greece, and is believed to have planned the kidnapping of Georgios Milonas, a Greek industrialist, as the ransom paid was traced back to our man here. In 2000, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the 1995 kidnapping of Alexander Haitoglu, the CEO of Haitoglu Bros, which he orchestrated with his brother Nikos, who is currently serving out the rest of his own sentence under house arrest due to his poor health. His first attempt to escape took place on Sunday, June 4th of 2006, when 2 accomplices hired a trip on a sightseeing helicopter from Agios Kosmas, a coastal suburb of Athens, and hijacked the helicopter, forcing the pilot to fly to the prison. When the helicopter arrived, guards believed the helicopter was a visit from prison inspectors, so the helicopter was able to fly the prisoners out to a cemetery nearby, where they transferred to motorcycles and fled from there. Vasilis was recaptured 2 years later, on August 2nd, 2008, in Thessaloniki. Don't worry, I'm not gonna leave y'all without the details of the better escape. On Sunday, February 22nd of 2009, Vasilis again escaped from Athens' Korydallos prison by helicopter. I'm sensing a theme here, but hey, if it works, it works. He and his cellmate, Elket Rizai, climbed a rope ladder thrown to them by a female passenger in the helicopter as it flew over the prison courtyard. Police said an elderly couple found the helicopter abandoned in the Athenian suburb of Kapandriti, near a highway north of Athens, with its fuel tank leaking and the pilot left behind, bound and gagged, with a hood over his head. He told the police the helicopter was chartered by a couple who claimed they wanted to go from the town of Itia in central Greece to Athens. The couple had chartered the helicopter a number of times in previous weeks, with the woman posing as a businesswoman. According to the pilot, who claimed to have been forced into taking part in the escape, Vasilis and Alket were delivered to a getaway car, and that's all he knew. The government of Greece faced intense criticism after his second escape from this same facility, and the government responded by firing 3 Justice Ministry officials and arresting 3 prison guards. Talk about majorly messing up on the job. I'm glad that if I mess up in my line of work, that usually just means my tongue didn't want to work properly, and it's easily fixed by talking more. Vasilis is still at large with a €1 million bounty for information leading to his arrest. And while this is all impressive, something that stood out to me while doing my research is that Vasilis wrote an autobiography entitled A Normal Life, and it was published in November of 2021 by Freedom Press. While the irony of the publishing company name makes me chuckle, it's fascinating that he's been able to publish a book without being recaptured.
Coming in at number 5, we've got Christopher David Meir. Most folks would expect a few murderers and drug runners to make the list, but what I find to be especially terrifying and heinous is the purposeful setting of expensive and harmful fires. That's right, we are kicking this list off with a serial arsonist who seems to have disappeared completely. Back in January of 2007, police began investigating crimes that caused over $2 million in damages and made people genuinely scared for their lives. It wasn't just setting fires, it was also extortion. Apparently, a father-son duo decided that some financial disputes were worth setting fires over. The father, Jonathan David Meir, was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison for planning these crimes. Christopher David Meir, however, is still in the breeze. He was the one to actually set the fires, making him a very destructive desperado. Police have spent over $400,000 investigating these crimes and have come up short when tasked with bringing the arsonist to justice. In fact, back in 2015, they renewed a $25,000 reward for anyone who could provide tips that would lead to Meir's arrest. Unfortunately, this big boon wasn't enough to bring him in. Doesn't seem like he's been setting any more fires though, which leads one to believe that the original crimes were committed as a personal vendetta of sorts. However, this blonde-haired blaze setter could very well be planning another fire. Coming in at number 4, we've got William Bradford Bishop Jr. That's one hell of a name, wouldn't you say? He's been on the run for quite a while too. The FBI's been chasing this murderous man since 1976 and has followed a lot of false leads down strange rabbit holes in doing so. See, Mr. Bishop was once an American diplomat. After spending years traveling to different posts overseas, he ended up working a post in Washington, D.C. He'd been passed over for promotion and appeared to be feeling sort of ill. He left work and headed home. On the way to his family home in Maryland, he stopped by a bank to withdraw some money and a hardware store where he bought a sledgehammer, gas can, pitchfork, and shovel. Not a very promising array of items, is it? That evening, he used his new arsenal to kill his wife, mother, and 3 children. Afterwards, he buried their bodies in a shallow grave in a swamp and lit it on fire. Since then, he's been on the run. As an avid outdoorsman and an amateur pilot, he has a variety of skills that would help him avoid detection. They've proven to be quite effective too, as he remains at large to this day. In 2014, authorities believed that they had found a grave where his remains were buried, but the DNA didn't match. Mr. Bishop could very well be too old to commit more crimes, but a life on the run might encourage one to indulge in more criminal activities. Coming in at number 3, we've got Vasilis Paleokostas. With nicknames like Robin Hood and Uncatchable, you know this guy means business. Right now, he's on the lam and has a €1 million bounty on his head. Crazy, right? Well, you'd have a bounty like that too if you'd escaped the same prison twice, both times by helicopter. Yeah, that's right. This man escaped from the high-security Korydallos prison. 2 pals of his hijacked a helicopter, landed it at the prison, convinced guards that they were prison inspectors, and then picked up Paleokostas. The helicopter then flew the fugitive to a nearby cemetery where he hopped on a motorcycle and made a speedy getaway. 2 years later, he was recaptured and brought back to the prison. But guess what? No walls can hold the uncatchable man back. In 2009, another helicopter escape was pulled off, resulting in a short airborne gunfight and a clean getaway. No injuries, thankfully, and now he's a free man once again. Well, actually, a prison guard injured himself while trying to draw his weapon, but we'll check that up to something else entirely. The helicopter pilot was found bound and gagged in the empty cockpit a while later. He detailed a cover story that the escapees gave to him. They'd even chartered the helicopter multiple times in the weeks leading up to the escape to make it seem sort of normal. No other real details have been found. To this day, this robber kidnapper escapee remains on the run. Imagine having friends willing to fly a helicopter into the same prison twice for you. What a life. Coming in at number 2, we've got Glenn Stewart Godwin. We've got more prison breaks here. This escapee seems to be a lot more violent than our last culprit though. Glenn Stewart Godwin escaped from Folsom State Prison in California in 1987. He'd been serving a lengthy murder sentence for stabbing a drug dealer / pilot dozens of times. Somehow he managed to get a variety of tools smuggled in, cut his way through a fence, crawled through a storm drain, and ended up making his way down to a raft that his accomplice left for him. Later that very same year, he was arrested again for trafficking drugs in Mexico. This earned him a one-way ticket to a prison in Guadalajara. And when I say one way, I do mean until he broke out. That's right, there are 2 double prison breakers on this list. Some people are just really good at certain things. For these folks, apparently that's breaking jail. While serving his sentence in Mexico, Godwin apparently killed a fellow inmate before hightailing it out of there a few months later. Can you imagine the amount of work it would take to escape a prison after literally murdering someone there? Like, the guards would definitely be keeping a close eye on him, and he still managed to make it out. Sure, murder is bad, but that's impressive. These days, he's suspected to be playing some role in the drug trade in Latin America. Aliases have been used, but no solid evidence has been found. And finally, at number 1, we've got Matteo Messina Denaro. Before going into hiding in 1993, this mafia-connected maniac claimed, "I filled a cemetery all by myself." Known as the last Mohican of the old mafia, Denaro has extensive connections who are willing to keep him hidden. Not something you want to hear about a deadly killer, but that's just how the world works sometimes. After racking up over 50 murders, he went underground. It appears that plenty of politicians and businessmen are willing to bankroll his hidden lifestyle too. He supposedly lives quite the luxurious lifestyle these days. In fact, a wind farm tycoon was recently brought down for having Denaro on his bankroll. That's the kind of power this potential mafia boss holds. If money wasn't enough to shield him, he's also got some wicked connections. According to prosecutors and investigators, Denaro has been shielded by Freemasons in Trapani. And I mean, if the mafia alone was something you didn't want to mess with, then you definitely don't want to add the Freemasons in there. Maybe he's backed by the Illuminati too.
Coming at number 5, we have David Sweet and Richard Matt, 2 convicted killers that were locked away in a maximum security prison that were never supposed to get out, but it turns out that several feet of concrete and steel wasn't enough to keep these guys locked up. These 2 were cell neighbors, and they would spend their time talking to one another about how much they hated being in prison and what they should do to get out. Well, it turns out that these dudes were not all talk and actually came up with a plan that was even craftier than a Hollywood movie. These guys waited until lights out. When the guard did their final tour, both these guys were still in bed. From there, everything is speculation, but it would seem that these guys both got up and somehow had power tools in their cells. The wild thing is, if you go into the prison report, there weren't any power tools missing, so that means these guys either had someone on the inside who was working with them and snuck them power tools from the prison, or even crazier, there was someone on the outside who was able to pass them power tools on the inside. Well, the police discovered that these 2 men were not in their cells, and the first thing they noticed was that they had makeshift dummies in their beds, so no one could tell that they were not actually in their beds. Then they saw a massive hole in the wall which they followed through, and they were able to break down how they escaped. They cut a hole in the wall and got into the framework of the building. From there, they followed some catwalks to some piping and used the piping to shimmy down 4 stories and get into the sewer system below the prison. After this, they came to a large gate that was chained up with a massive padlock. They cut through the lock and were able to get through the door in no time. From this, they were able to get to a manhole and some fresh clothes that they had stolen, and after that, they were finally out of the prison. One of the best pieces of this crime was the fact that they left behind a note that said, "Have a nice day." That's a pretty savage way to leave your mark behind, so people know that you were not only gone, but also so rude with the whole thing. Thousands of people were questioned in this case as to what happened to these men, but no one really had any answers. Some of the conspiracy theories around this escape say that these men were able to bribe people in the prison, or they might have had dirt on the warden, but that is all hearsay. The only way we'll really be able to get to the bottom of how these men were able to sneak out of a maximum security prison in a single night without anyone knowing is if they get caught. And even if they get caught, they might never spill the beans on this story. And guys, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It really helps us out. Coming in number 2, we have Frank Abagnale. If you've seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, then you actually know a decent amount about one of the best con artists of all time. Frank Abagnale started writing fake checks when he was only a teenager, and he would try to impersonate every professional to try and get ahead. He impersonated doctors, lawyers, pilots. All of them were in the wheelhouse of faces that this guy would try and pull off. There was one time where he posed in front of a bank claiming to be a security guard and stood next to the cash deposit box. He told everyone that the box was out of order and they needed to leave their deposits with him. One by one, they left packages of cash with Frank, who had zero affiliation with the bank. He walked off with thousands with this little scheme. Now, eventually the police caught up with him and they were able to arrest him and send him to prison. He was arrested in Britain and he was on a plane headed back to JFK, but right after the plane landed, he was able to slip away and was on the run for a few more months before the police caught up with him again. They had him in handcuffs handcuffs, and this time he wasn't going to get away. It seemed that this was a done deal for Frank Abagnale, but when he was in processing, he saw a golden opportunity. The corrections officer who was processing him didn't have his paperwork, and this seemed very strange, but they were going to lock him up anyways, of course. Well, Frank would slip something in to ensure he was able to make another escape. He told the corrections officer that the reason that he didn't have his paperwork was because he was actually doing an inspection of the prison and was actually a government official. At the time of Frank's arrest, many prisons around America were under inspection because of civil rights violations. So this correction officer took the bait. They thought they could pull a fast one on this so-called inspections officer by giving him the best treatment that he's ever seen, and they would let him be on his way, and that's exactly what they did. Frank was treated like a king for a week straight. He got everything he wanted in the cushiest prison experience imaginable. Then right after, he was able to walk out the doors a free man. Eventually word about this got out to the press, and this is what made him a celebrity around the globe. But of course Frank was later arrested again, and this time he didn't escape. But when he was released again, he would start working with the CIA to try and crack down on counterfeiting. Coming in at number 3, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. If you're the one on the outside looking in, it would seem that getting out of prison would be one of the hardest things you could ever do. You would have to be some sort of mastermind that could rival Batman. You have to come up with a plan that has every little detail figured out, because one slip up could have you back behind bars or in solitary confinement. But then you hear some of these stories of how people were able to break free from prison, and you realize you could really be anyone and you could sneak out. You just need to be bold enough to do so. This is pretty much how Glenn Stark Chambers was able to get out of prison. Chambers was a murderer, and he was actually supposed to be dead before he ever got the chance to slip out of prison. He was sentenced to death row, and everything was teed up for lethal injection, but then his sentencing was brought down to life in prison. I'm not sure which one is worse. Well, for Chambers, spending life in prison was a much better alternative because it gave him the time to plan his escape. So one day, Glenn was working in the furniture packing area in the prison. You had to build couches and then put them into boxes, load them onto a van, and the van would take them to who knows where. Well, Glenn had the split-second idea that why not, instead of putting a couch into one of these boxes, I put myself into one of these boxes. He got his prison buddies to pack him up in there and then load it onto a van, and guess what? Nobody noticed. He was loaded onto the back of a van and taken right out of the prison, and not a single person realized that one of the prisoners was missing from the group. Not until they did head count later that night. But by that time, Chambers was long gone. The van that Chambers got into eventually pulled over. Chambers used this opportunity to burst out of the box and change his clothes. He was smart enough to bring some civilian clothes to change into, and right after that he was out of the back of the van and off running. Chambers was being held in the Florida Polk Corrections Facility. Chambers already had family in Florida, so it's suspected that he first ran off to go meet his family, who then helped him hide when he was on the run. There have been reports of him both in Alabama and in Florida, but none of these sightings have turned into an arrest. Coming in number 2, we have Empress Matilda. In the year 1142, there was a war raging across England, and the Empress Matilda was being held captive. Her cousin Stefan knew that the throne was his and he was going to take it right from her hands, and he imprisoned her and took over the country. Well, Matilda wasn't going to take this lying down. She waited until winter and came up with a plan for escape. There was a large lake that separated her castle from the Wellington Castle, and she knew that if she could make it across this lake, she could find sanctuary there. So she crafted her own ice skates, put on a large white cape for both warmth and camouflage, and took off skating across the lake one night. She was able to make it to the Wallingford Castle, and eventually there was a truce made in the war. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Yoshi Shiratori. Probably one of the wildest escape stories you will ever hear. Yoshi Shiratori escaped from prison 4 times. This guy refused to stay in prison. First, Shiratori was arrested after a short trial, and he was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison, and they slapped on another 20 years on top of that. Well, Shiratori didn't like this one bit, and when no one was looking, he climbed the walls of the prison and took off on foot. That's one way to break out of prison. You just use sheer upper body strength. This was in 1936, and he would spend a few years on the run, not needing to worry about the crushing pain of a prison. But then in 1940, 1942, he was caught again and would use a similar tactic of scaling the walls to sneak out of prison life. You think after breaking out of prison twice you would never go back, but you would be wrong. Shiratori was caught again in 1944, and this time he would come up with his second most famous escape plan, but in my opinion, his most ingenious. He took some miso soup that they served him in his cell, and then he used it to rust the lock on his handcuffs and the lock on his cell so they could both easily be broken. Then after everyone went to sleep, he snapped them both open and was on the run before anyone woke up. He would spend another 2 years in the wild running from the police, but when he got caught the next time, he would be sentenced to death. Well, Shiratori wasn't about to die in prison. If you haven't realized by now, this guy isn't someone who you tell what to do. So Shiratori tunneled out of the prison and escaped again. He was caught one final time when he found a police officer and admitted that he was a convict, and then he was returned to jail. He wasn't given the death sentence, though he was eventually released from prison in the 60s after he served his full sentence.
Number 5. John Dillinger. John Dillinger is one of America's most prolific bank robbers. Hearing his name calls to mind fast-paced car chases, slick fedoras, revolvers, and banknotes. And for good reason. Dillinger managed to hit 24 banks in his lifetime. And I couldn't find any information on whether or not this is true. I'm pretty sure he holds the world record for most banks robbed. I have a strong feeling that he does. He was imprisoned multiple times over his crime career, but you couldn't keep a good career criminal like this down because he escaped prison multiple times. Now, the first time, Dillinger's gang disguised themselves as police officers, but his most famous escape was during 1934. After robbing the East Chicago First National Bank, Dillinger fired at a police officer, sealing his fate and landing him with some pretty serious charges, as up until then he was only charged with robberies. After the heist, a fire broke out at a hotel the gang was laying low at, leading to a tip that led authorities to Dillinger, who shipped him away to Crown Point, Indiana, and treated him as one of their most dangerous prisoners. All of them expecting him to try and escape again. And they were right to think that, because he did. Dillinger was surrounded by 6 guards at all times, armed and ready. But despite this, and the little free time he had, Dillinger was still able to carve a fake pistol out of an old piece of washboard using razor blades. Dillinger used his homemade wooden pistol to threaten the guards at, well, not quite gunpoint, but wood point, I guess, and forced them to free him and lead him out of jail. Dillinger jacked a car from a nearby alleyway, and with hostages under his wing, Dillinger had escaped again. This would lead to Edgar Hoover tightening up an FBI task force just to hunt down John Dillinger, placing a $10,000 bounty on his head. This led to an accomplice of Dillinger ratting him out, leading to his fatal final encounter with the police in an alleyway outside a Chicago movie theater, ending the legendary gangster's crime spree. Want to hear more about weird crimes? Subscribe to Top 5 Scary for way more every day. Let's keep going. Number 4. The Texas 7. The Texas 7 refers to a gang of 7 highly dangerous inmates who ganged together in 2000 to hatch an escape plan from John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security state prison in South Texas. The group comprised all kinds of nasty criminals, some on death row. Some of them were even serving 99-year sentences. All of them were serving long sentences with no chance of parole, and as such, they looked for other options to regain their freedom. Now, what they had was strength in numbers. On December 13, 2000, the group launched their plan into action. They'd waited for the slowest part of the day when guard patrols were at their most thin, and plain and simple, started knocking officers out. They would have one member of the 7 beckon an officer over and another restraining and knocking him unconscious from behind. From here, they kept taking pages out of Agent 47's notebook and hid the officers' bodies, tied them up, and placed in a locked door, and stole their uniforms, credit cards, and ID from the victims. They then posed as police to ward off suspicion. From here, 3 of the men made their way to the back of the prison, changed into civilian disguises, and posed as a surveillance camera crew to install new monitors. They knocked out another guard and raided the guard tower and stole numerous weapons to take with them. The 4 who'd stayed behind stole a prison maintenance truck, picked up their co-conspirators, and fled the scene. Their newfound freedom barely lasted though, as the men had left a trail of evidence and were on the FBI's most wanted. Not helping matters was that mere days after the escape, they robbed a store, which eventually led to the death of an officer, leading to a $500,000 bounty for the capture of the Texas 7. A year later, after several tips, the FBI apprehended what members were still living who had scattered across the country. Those they found are back in prisons, unlikely to ever pull something like that off again. Number 3. El Chapo. El Chapo, otherwise known as Joaquin Guzman, is one of the most notorious drug lords to ever live. He founded the Sinaloa cartel in the 80s and dominated the trade. Over his long career, he was captured and arrested several times, but made a prolific habit of his escapes. His first arrest was in 1993, and it didn't stop him from running operations at all out of the minimum security prison, but it wouldn't always be this easy. In 2001, the cartel bribed the guards, who loaded Guzman into a laundry cart and simply wheeled him out of the prison like it was nothing. The next 14 years would see Guzman continuing out operations as normal, undeterred by his short time in the clink. He was incarcerated again in 2014, and this time the escape was a lot more elaborate, and he had a lot more help. In Altiplano Federal Prison, Guzman disappeared entirely in July, and authorities were stunned to discover that the cartel had been digging a tunnel for months that led directly from a small 2-foot hole in the showers. The tunnel spanned nearly a mile and was fitted with lights, ventilation, and most amazingly, had a motorcycle all ready to go for Guzman to ride to freedom, all the way to a cinder block house that had been constructed at the end of it. He would manage to elude capture again, for a bit at least, until 2016, where he would face extradition. He's currently incarcerated again, and knowing his reputation, who knows if he'll stay there. Number 2. Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair's story is perhaps one of the most wild prison break stories I had ever read. It's probably the most wild one on this list, to be honest. McNair was raised by a police officer, but would find himself straying from the law when in 1987 he robbed a grain storage facility in North Dakota, where he fatally shot at a man and wounded another. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, and a burglary charge on top of that. Unhappy with his new surroundings, McNair would sneak through a ventilation pipe in North Dakota State Pen in 1993, although he was swiftly recaptured. Now, one escape from prison is already pretty cool, but it was his second escaped attempt that was infinitely more impressive. McNair was eventually transferred to a federal prison in Pollock, Louisiana. McNair was assigned to the work detail in the manufacturing room, where he would repair broken items, including patching up old mail bags, which inspired him to hatch an ingenious plan. In secret, McNair built himself what he called his escape pod, a small compartment with a breathing tube he would hide inside. Now, he hid himself inside the mailbag pile, shrink wrapped and forklifted to a nearby warehouse outside of the prison. He mailed himself out of jail. He says the heat was unimaginable, that it felt like being inside a furnace, and that he was afraid he was going to pass out. When the warehouse staff broke for lunch, McNair cut himself free and fled the prison as fast as he could. He was apprehended by a local police officer, but managed to convince the cop that he was just a local jogger and not that escaped convict everybody's looking for. McNair fled to Canada, living across British Columbia, Ontario, and eventually settling in New Brunswick. Having successfully escaped the long arm of the law and living on the lam, fighting the law and winning. Take that, The Clash. Well, for about a year, at least. Despite managing his impressive escape, he was widely known, featuring on America's Most Wanted, and had to live a pretty quiet lifestyle. He was reported cited in Canada multiple times. Eventually, he would end up being busted for driving a stolen white van in 2007, describing his capture as just being bad luck. Just one of those days, McNair said. After a year on the lam, McNair was returned to the States, where he is now interred in a supermax prison deemed for prisoners where maximum security isn't enough. But I'm sure he's plotting a way to get out of this one. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz was built to wear down the hopes of the most rebellious prisoners. The infamous San Fran Island was known as the Rock for how heavily guarded and seemingly inescapable it was. Of course, if you know about the movie Escape from Alcatraz, then you already know in 1962, 3 daredevil convicts did the impossible and managed to escape the unescapable. Between 1934 and 1962, there were 13 failed escape attempts. But I guess if anything, that just served as inspiration for inmates Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, who would prove everyone wrong. They had planned this for months. Frank Morris brought in his accomplices John and Clarence, and their 4th accomplice, Alan West, who had all met each other from previous incarcerations and had a pretty good thing going. During the days, they stole spoons and discarded saw blades from the workyard, and spent upwards of 7 months widening the ventilation ducts in each of their cells, with Frank Morris loudly playing the accordion to conceal their handiwork. That's hilarious, by the way. Whenever they weren't working on it, they covered the holes with gray painted cardboard. The ducts would lead to a tunnel where the 4 men had stored a 6 by 14 foot raft that the men had made out of discarded raincoats, held together with soap and sealed with heat from the steam pipes. These guys were unbelievably crafty because check this out too. They assembled dummy heads out of paper mache, hair from the barbers, and painted them as realistically as they possibly could. They stuffed laundry and discarded rags under their blankets with their paper heads poking out while they escaped so it looked like they were sleeping. That is hilarious. That's like Ferris Bueller stuff. Unfortunately, on the night of the escape, Alan West was left behind when he couldn't get the grill of his duct off. The other men, however, weren't willing to wait around, grabbed the raft, slid down to the roof, and snuck to the shore. Now what happened next is lost to time. The prevailing theory is that the men drowned in the harsh waters on the way out, although the Anglin family claims that the men had escaped. Regardless of the truth, the men did the impossible.
Coming in at number 5, Randall Sato, Hawaii State Hospital. Randall Sato was committed to Hawaii State Hospital back in 1981 after being acquitted of the murder of Sandra Yamashiro by reason of insanity. However, back in 2017, he left the hospital and never returned. According to prosecutor Wayne Tashima, I quote, "He is a very dangerous individual and that he could commit the same heinous and violent offences again." According to the Honolulu police, Sato left the hospital at approximately 10 a.m. on Sunday and took a taxi to the airport. It was there that he met a plane he had chartered online under a different name, according to reports. He then changed clothes into a black jacket, white printed aloha shirt, and baseball cap before boarding a plane headed to Maui. From there, he caught a plane to San Jose, California. According to court records, Sato has since been charged with felony escape in the second degree, with bail being set at $500,000. Since being committed back in 1981, Sato has attempted to earn release from the hospital countless times over his 4-decade stay there. Back in 1993, a court denied his request for conditional release on the grounds that he continued to suffer from sexual sadism and necrophilia. Jumping ahead to 2000, and the deputy city prosecutor Jeff Albert claimed that Sato had all the criteria of a classic serial killer. Coming in at number 4, Jason Murray, Hamilton Mental Health Hospital. Back in 2018, Jason Murray was a patient potentially posing a threat to the public after escaping from the Hamilton Mental Health Hospital. The 38-year-old man at the time was being treated in the forensic unit after being found not criminally responsible back in 2016 in a case involving a concealed weapon, harassment, and threats. Now, at the time of his escape, Jason was being supervised by 2 staff members when he suddenly bolted over a fence and ran deep into the woods at around 2:30 p.m. The hospital referred to it as a very unusual coincidence that these 2 things happened so close together. We're extraordinarily careful. We have a lot of processes in place to reduce the likelihood of these kind of events happening. Now, the 2 events they're referring to are the escape of Jason as well as the escape of Sina Lorne, who was on an unsupervised grounds pass when he walked away from the hospital's forensic unit on June 4th and was missing for over 24 hours. According to reports, I quote, "He threw down the coffee he was drinking and ran. The staff were unable to keep up to him." These are trained individuals. They're constantly looking to make sure there's nothing about the patient that indicates they might act in a dangerous fashion to the public or to themselves. Risk management is what we do. Lorne, who has schizophrenia and polysubstance use disorder, randomly attacked a cab driver with a machete back in 2006, and then went on to attack his roommate with a samurai sword in 2017. In both cases, the hospital had no idea why the 2 men ran away so suddenly, especially considering that they had been on the grounds many times before without incident. As to whether Jason Murray was ever apprehended, we do not know. Coming in at number 3, we have Alan Reeve, Broadmoor. Back in 1981, killer Alan Reeve escaped from Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital in Berkshire, England. At the time, he was the second killer to escape in less than 3 weeks. He supposedly escaped by scaling an 18-foot inner wall using a grappling hook attached to a makeshift rope. First of all, how does anyone obtain a grappling hook? That's what I want to know. He then managed to get over the outer wall by climbing up some scaffolding. Now, according to records, Reeve was sent to Broadmoor at the age of 15 for stabbing and clubbing to death a friend. 4 years later, and he would go on to strangle a fellow patient at the asylum. Now, unlike the rest of our list, we have the start and end to this case. We have its entire history. Alan Reeve would not return to Broadmoor for 16 years. Following his escape, he fled to the Netherlands, but a year later he was captured after shooting dead a police officer in Amsterdam and was sentenced to 15 years in jail. When Reeve was eventually released on parole in 1992, he returned to Ireland where he lived before being returned to Broadmoor in 1997. This wasn't the only time someone successfully escaped from Broadmoor, with Reeve's initial escape following that of another patient. a child killer who escaped using a rope of knotted sheets. Coming in at number 2, 2 escapees, Western State Hospital. Back in 2009, not just one but 2 patients at Western State Hospital in Pierce County escaped, one during an outing at a Spokane fair and the other from the hospital itself. Philip Arnold Paul, who had been committed after being found not guilty by reason of insanity in the murder of an elderly woman, disappeared during a field trip to the Spokane County Interstate Fair with 30 other Eastern State Hospital patients and 11 staff members. According to reports, this was the second time Paul had escaped from state custody. Now, 3 days before Paul, a 33-year-old man who at the time was being held in a high-security criminal forensics facility at Western State Hospital, walked away from the facility, who was apparently missing for around 2 hours before being spotted by the hospital's employees. Back to Paul though, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was committed in 1987 for the strangulation of Ruth Motley. Paul told authorities that voices in his head told him Motley was a witch who was casting spells on him. According to the sheriff's office, Paul had disappeared from his group at around 11:15 a.m, but his absence was not reported until 2 hours later, giving him a 2-hour head start. As to what happened to him, we do not know. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Anthony Garver, Western State Hospital. Back in 2016, Anthony Garver, who was 28 at the time, escaped to Western State Hospital with fellow patient Mark Alexander Adams, with both of them escaping through a loose window. Now, Anthony Garver was a deranged patient accused of torturing a woman to death, while Mark Adams had been accused of domestic assault back in 2014. It was believed that Garver bought a bus ticket from Seattle across the state to Spokane. He is a known survivalist and is said to know the Spokane County area very well. I quote, "He's comfortable being out in the wilderness and adapts pretty easily. He has hidden in the woods before." Now, like I said, back in 2013, Garver was charged with attacking a 20-year-old woman with electrical cords before committing even further disgusting acts that I can't talk about right now. Garver was charged with murder, but was later found mentally incompetent to stand trial, with him then being sent to Western State. Garver has been convicted in the past of multiple charges and twice fled from authorities by stealing a car or even leading a high-speed chase. The escape is the latest in a litany of problems at the 800-bed hospital south of Tacoma, where violent assaults on both staff and patients have occurred. A federal judge also went on to state that the hospital has failed to provide timely competency services to mentally ill people charged with the crimes. Also, to leave a window loose or even open, a rookie mistake. You can't be taking those kinds of risks.
Starting in our number 5 spot, Frank, John, and Clarence. If you're familiar with stories from Alcatraz prison, then these names probably ring a bell. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were prisoners at San Francisco's Alcatraz maximum security prison. This prison was home to some of the most dangerous criminals, and it was said to be impossible to escape. Well, believe it or not, these men managed to break free. Morris, along with the Anglin brothers, plotted their daring escape for years before they actually carried out their plan on June 11, 1962. They crawled through air vents to reach the prison's roof, and then they shimmied down a large smokestack, and then once they were on the ground, they ran to the shoreline and they never looked back. What happened to the men beyond this point is a mystery. The guards of the prison like to say that the men drowned in the swirling currents of the San Francisco Bay before they were able to reach freedom. A manhunt was set into place, but the bodies were never found. On top of that, FBI investigations did conclude that even though the water was cold and the currents were strong, it was theoretically possible for one or more of the inmates to make it to land. Since the escaped family members of the inmates have claimed to have received phone calls and Christmas cards from these men on the run, very much implying that they are alive. In 2018, the FBI confirmed the existence of a letter allegedly written by escapee John Anglin, and this forced them to reopen the investigation into the case. The letter was received by the San Francisco Police Department in 2013. The start of the letter says, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter goes on to say how Frank died in 2008 and Clarence died 3 years later in 2011. In at number 4, the Honolulu Strangler. The Honolulu Strangler, who is also known as the Honolulu Rapist, was Hawaii's first known serial killer. He killed 5 women between 1985 and 1986. To this day, the killer has not been identified. As the killings went on, the police established a 27-person task force with help from the FBI. There was one person in particular who the police believed was responsible for this act, but with no witnesses willing to come forward, the police were forced to let him go. At number 3, the Doodler. The Doodler is an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for 14 14 murders and 3 assaults between January 1974 and September 1975. His attacks took place in San Francisco, and his victims were always men in the gay community. He would meet his victims at nightclubs or in other gay-friendly hotspots in the city. 3 of his victims survived, but since helping the investigation would out them essentially to the public, they chose not to testify against a suspect in court. But they did give a detailed description of the killer to the police, and this is the composite sketch that they came up with. The killer's name, the Doodler, was given to him because he had a habit of sketching his victims prior to killing them. Something that also linked the killings was his consistent method, where he would stab the victims in the front and the back of their bodies. Even though so many years have passed, this case is currently still open and ongoing in the San Francisco Police Department. In at number 2, Jack the Ripper. Over a century ago, London's most notorious serial killer roamed the East End. His main prey were prostitutes, and he killed at least 5 women that we know of. This neighborhood set into panic as these bodies were found within a 3-month period of each other in 1888, all within a mile of each other. Newspapers listed these killings as barbaric and too horrible to even describe. But basically, all of the victims had their throats slashed, and most of them had their stomachs slit and organs ripped out before the body was dumped on the street. His motive is still unknown. The FBI took a special interest in the case in 1988 at a request of a movie production company. Even with everyone in law enforcement looking into the case, the police were never able to put a face to the killer. The FBI noted that had we had the current technology we have today back then, it would have been possible to catch this person. One really key fact about this killer is the notes he left behind. The National Archives obtained letters exchanged between different law enforcement bosses in 1888, when all of these murders were first happening. The killer sent these letters to the London Metropolitan Police Service to taunt them and suggest that more murders were coming. Over the years, many people have speculated the identity of Jack the Ripper, but no one was ever prosecuted. So it looks like he took the secret to his grave. This makes him one of England's most famous unsolved mysteries, and one of the world's most infamous criminals. There was only one person to ever come close to naming the culprit, and that was author Russell Edwards, who in 2014 claimed he could prove the identity of Jack the Ripper based on DNA from a shawl that belonged to one of the female victims. The DNA points to Aaron Kosmicki, who was a Polish immigrant, and actually one of the prime suspects of the gruesome murders, but again to this day nothing has been verified. And in at number 1, the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer has a total of 5 confirmed murders, but it's expected that he killed an additional 20 to 28 people, and he wounded 2 others. All of these murders took place in the San Francisco Bay Area between the late 1960s and early 1970s. This killer's identity is still unknown to this day. All of these killings, and yet no one has been charged for them. Once the murders began, the killer started to taunt the police and the local paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, by sending them a total of 4 letters. They all contain these encrypted messages, which were pretty much impossible to crack. Out of all of these messages, only one has ever been deciphered. And while these letters were taunting, they did contain a number of leads. In fact, for a while, a man named Arthur Lee Allen was the name on the top of the suspect list. However, handwriting experts were unable to match his handwriting to the cipher or various letters. Over the years, people have come forward claiming to know the killer's true identity, but so far nothing has been proven through the court. So this man just got away with these killings and then disappeared into the night.
Starting us off at number 5, we have the Texas 7. Hailed as the biggest prison escape in Texan history, the famed escape happened in December of 2000, when 7 inmates forced their way out of maximum security prison John B. Connolly Unit in the isolated Texas town of Kennedy. The escape was led by George Rivas, who was 30 at the time and serving 18 consecutive life sentences for burglary and kidnapping. 2 of the group were also convicted murderers. The Texas 7 began their prison break by overpowering 2 guards and 8 maintenance men, stealing their clothes and the keys to a truck after locking them in a utility closet. They then fooled several other guards in a watchtower to hand over a cache of weapons before tying them up and fleeing the prison in a truck. The infamous group then went on a day-long crime spree from San Antonio to Dallas and then to Colorado, where they were eventually captured. Sadly though, not before killing 29-year-old police officer Aubrey Hawkins, who bravely attempted to apprehend the group. The Texas 7 were eventually captured and secured back into the prison system. At number 4, we have the story of an escape at the Everglades Correctional Institute in Florida. Now, there's nothing stronger than a mother's love for her child, especially if that child is sentenced to serve 20 years in jail for armed robbery. J. Jr. Sigler, who was 31 at the time, had already served 8 years of hard time before the events took place. But his mother, 58-year-old Sandra Sigler, was hatching a plan that would reunite the pair without the consent of the local law. The prison, spread over almost 100 acres of coral rock, was designed to be one of the most secure and advanced in the state, with concrete slab cell blocks, buried motion sensors, and multiple chain link fences. Sandra, along with 2 accomplices, set into motion a plan that would see her son home, and she did just that. The group got hold of a big rig tractor, and during broad daylight, they plowed through the prison's front gates, as well as multiple maximum security razor-topped fences. Sandra followed close behind in an Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, and when the assailants reached the prison unit, they then had a gunfight with guards whilst waiting for Jay Jr. to make his break. The plan worked, and they roared out of the complex into the streets of southwest Miami. Sandra and her accomplices were swiftly caught, but J. Jr. Sigler soon disappeared into the Florida swamps and Everglades. He was later captured, but the daring escape deeply shocked the Sunshine State. Coming in at number 3, we have a story all the way from Vologda in Russia. Alexei Shestakov had been sentenced to 24 years in prison for the murder of 8 people. The prison in Vologda is located roughly 500 kilometers north of Moscow and is pretty isolated from the rest of the country. Now, it's important to note, at the time of his escape, Alexei had served roughly half of his term. He'd spent nearly 12 years in a pretty desolate, isolated prison. So, no one expected what happened next. During exercise time in the prison yard, guards and prisoners alike were perplexed at the sight of a helicopter hovering above their heads. The chopper quickly descended, and Alexei made his dash, grabbing a rope ladder that was thrown from above. The prisoner clung on for his life, and the helicopter swooped away out into the Russian wilderness. It all happened so fast that the guards didn't even have time to react. Alexei and his accomplices left the helicopter, as well as the pilot, who they had bound and gagged on the northern edges of Vologda. His escape was short-lived though, after police quickly found the group, and Alexei was wounded in the exchange of gunfire. The court added 12 years to his prison term, where he still remains to this day. Bringing it in at number 2, we have the explosive tale of French gangster Antonio Ferreira. Antonio's criminal career is something straight out of a Tarantino movie. He was part of a group of incredibly successful bank robbers who had nicknamed themselves the Dream Team. At the time, they were labeled the most dangerous gang in Europe by Interpol. Antonio was particularly famous in the French underworld for his uncanny ability to create the perfect explosive device that would blow open a safe but leave the cash completely unharmed. At the tender age of 29, Antonio was finally caught and sentenced to serve an 8-year prison term for 2 armed robberies, as well as being the key suspect for at least 15 more. Well, 5 years into his prison career, the explosive expert decided that he'd had just about enough and hatched a plan to escape the French prison. At 4:30 a.m. on a March morning in 2003, 6 men drove up to the front gates in fake police cars, clothed in police uniforms and ski masks. Check this, they blew up the gates with rocket-propelled grenade launchers. During the commotion, Antonio blew up his own cell door with a stick of dynamite believed to have been given to him by one of the prison guards. Once out, he joined up with the gang and fled. The whole thing took 10 minutes. Antonio was on the loose for a staggering 4 months and was declared France's most wanted man by then-President Nicolas Sarkozy. He was later recaptured after the efforts of a massive undercover operation at a bar in Paris. As the arresting officer slapped on the cuffs, he was quoted as saying just one thing: "You again." And finally, coming in at number 1, we have a story that is equally scary to both its prisoners as well as the general public. When you think prison escape, you think Alcatraz, the infamous San Francisco prison that has been hailed as the most impossible prison to escape in the world. Built on an actual rock, Alcatraz had some insane security policies. Rows and rows of iron grates, 12 cell checks per day, and the fact that the prison itself was surrounded by the ice-cold waters of the Pacific. 4 men were brave enough to make the attempt, and on June 11th, 1962, after weeks of meticulous planning, Frank Morris and brothers Clarence and John Anglin decided they had just about enough of being locked behind bars. After leaving Alan West behind, their other co-conspirator, the trio scaled 30 feet of plumbing to the prison roof, where they also plunged a further 50 feet of piping to the shore below. Now, everyone who had attempted to escape Alcatraz before had ended up dead, their bodies washed up on the shores of San Francisco Bay. But the bodies of Morris and the Anglins were never found, with many believing that they actually made it to freedom, and who knows, they could still be roaming around freely to this very day.